Hello and welcome to this short session debriefing the December 2023 ICMAP Pathway Exam. My name's Rachel Norman, I'm ACCA's Specialist Solutions Lead and I'm part of the technical team which looks after the running of the pathway into ACCA membership for eligible members of ICMAP. The aim here is really similar to the previous sessions we've done debriefing previous exam diets. The aim is to talk through the exam paper, the solution and the published examiner report and really bring these to life with lots of examples of areas where candidates did well and also examples of areas where candidates struggled in the exam and ways you can use those to strengthen your own exam technique and help you prepare for future sittings of the ICMAP exam. So I'd recommend here that you pause the session and make sure that you have to hand the exam paper, solutions, mark scheme and examiner report and then click again to continue while we talk through the paper. Before we look at each of the questions and the requirements from the paper, it's worth just quickly recapping on the format of the exam. The format of the December 23 exam is unchanged from previous sittings with a total length of 4 hours. In the exam, there are 2 questions worth 50 marks each, giving a total maximum score of 100 for the exam. This 100 marks is split between 80 technical marks, 40 in each question, and 20 marks, 10 in each question, for how well candidates demonstrate the required professional skills, such as commercial acumen, communication, and analysis. We'll talk more about these professional skills as we move through the session. In the December 2023 exam, the first question focused on Millikan AI Solutions, a company specializing in developing artificial intelligence solutions. Question 2 focused on a company making components for combustion engines for cars called Tingle Automotive. Overall, the standard of candidates' answers in the December 2023 exam was poor and worse than we've seen in previous sittings of the exam. Usually, the examining team focused predominantly on weak exam technique as the reason why most unsuccessful candidates were not able to pass the exam. But for this diet, there also seems to be much more evidence of candidates struggling with their theoretical and technical knowledge of topics across the syllabus. Before we move into looking at the December exam in more detail, I'd like to cover the high-level recommendations from the examining team. In terms of technical knowledge, we're recommending that you take the time to really review the syllabus for the pathway exam in detail and ensure that your preparation fully covers all areas of the syllabus. Remember, you can be tested on any areas within the syllabus in your exam, and these are all covered within the learning materials that you have access to. Once you've got your sound theoretical knowledge in any area, it's also vital that you're able to apply this knowledge to a case study question. The way to do this is through question practice. And again, you've got access to lots of resources to help you look at practice questions. As well as the ones contained within the learning materials, you have access to all the past papers of the pathway exam. Combined with the solutions, examiner reports, and these debrief sessions for those past papers, you should be able to get a clear guide as to the level of answer required to successfully pass this exam. To help you in your preparation, remember that the usual recommendation remains to take advantage of the available tuition if it's at all possible for you to do so. So, we've mentioned weak exam technique in the examiner report for this exam sitting, as well as for previous exam sessions, so it's worth exploring a bit more what this looks like in candidates' answers. Weaknesses in exam technique can lead to candidates wasting a lot of time in the exam, which costs them both technical and professional skills marks. It can often make the difference between a pass and a fail. There are 3 main examples which come up again and again when we are looking at answer scripts to the ICMAP exam, and these were all apparent in some answers to the December paper. The first thing we often see is candidates spending a lot of time rewriting information from the scenario in their answers. There are no marks available for doing this and it just wastes time. The marks are available for using what's in the scenario to come up with relevant points and advice. This links nicely into the second common weakness that we see. Many candidates understand the scenario and the question, but make very generic theoretical points in their answers which could really apply to any company and not just the one in the scenario. In an exam at this level, all the points you make need to be tailored to the facts and the circumstances of the question. And lastly, we often see a lack of planning in candidates' answers, either with answers too short to score most of the available marks, answers which are unnecessarily long and become repetitive, or answers which wander off track and don't really ever actually answer what the task is asking for. All of these can be addressed by taking a few minutes to plan your answer before jumping in. Think about the number of marks available for each task and roughly how long you should spend on each one. We'll look at this in relation to some of the December questions shortly. So try to bear these points in mind as you prepare for sitting the pathway exam in future, or when you attempt any practice questions. Being aware of these three areas in your answer can make a huge difference to the score that you're ultimately awarded. Let's move into the December 2023 paper now, starting with question 1 on Millikan AI solutions. In this question, candidates were asked to assume the role of an external consultant hired to advise one of the company's founders. We're going to move through each of the requirements in this question, looking at how candidates performed in the December sitting, but also the areas to watch out for and focus on for anyone preparing for future sittings of the exam using this debrief. I'd recommend you pause the session here, take your time to read this question, both the question and the solutions, before clicking to continue. The first requirement of the December exam asked candidates to look at some proposed performance indicators, which had been given in an exhibit to the question, and assess how each could be used to measure progress against the company's new mission and objectives. Candidates were also asked to recommend how these proposed indicators could be improved, which gives us a very heavy hint that they're not going to be perfect. If you look at Exhibit 1 in the exam paper, you can see that the proposed indicators are listed in pairs under each of the 4 perspectives from the balanced scorecard. This is also really helpful for planning how many marks and how much writing you can be expecting to do here. The whole requirement is worth 16 marks, and we have 4 perspectives, or 8 indicators, to comment on. That's only a couple of marks per indicator. Remember, the exam is 4 hours long and covers 100 marks in total, an average of a little over 2 minutes a mark. Working to about 2 minutes per mark is a good rough guide to make sure that you're getting through the whole paper. In this requirement, you won't score marks talking about the indicators on their own or the theory of the balanced scorecard. If you look at the solution here, you can see that marks are being awarded for talking about the company's mission and objectives and for making specific comments about each of the proposed performance indicators in relation to these. Don't forget about those recommendations for improvement too. If we step back and look at the mission and objectives, we might notice that there is no performance indicator that's connected to our objective of fostering strategic partnerships. That's got to be the main recommendation for improvement here. Following on from part 1, candidates now needed to look at the balanced scorecard approach itself. Candidates were asked to advise on potential problems for this company in implementing the balanced scorecard approach. A lot of candidates went wrong here by talking about what the balanced scorecard is. That's not what the question is asking for, and it won't score any marks. Other candidates gave some generic problems in implementing a balanced scorecard approach, but these could have applied to any company. For example, just saying a lack of leadership support is generic, and it will score very limited marks. But explaining that Alicia has proposed this approach, Omar and Xander are skeptical, and the effects that this may have for the company, that's specific and it will score much better. I'd encourage you to have a look at the model answer here for how some possible theoretical problems, which you might see in a textbook, can be applied to the scenario, and it's this application which the examining team is looking for. Question 1b asked candidates to look at whether the company should adopt a particular organizational structure, a matrix structure. For the 8 available marks, candidates were asked to discuss both the advantages and disadvantages for the company. Very similarly to the previous requirement here, it's not enough to just list generic advantages and disadvantages of any company adopting a matrix structure here. All the points need to be linked to the company, the people, and the situation in the case study. This lack of application was really evident in a lot of candidates' answers to this requirement. Other candidates also seemed to struggle at the earlier step of understanding what a matrix structure was. All the topics and ideas within the exam are covered in the learning materials and the syllabus, so it is essential that you're familiar with these. Moving on now to the final part of question 1, where candidates were asked to calculate a target cost gap and recommend some reasons supporting the company producing one of its devices for external sale. This requirement contains both narrative and computational elements. In requirements like this, candidates often focus on one part or the other, but don't always cover both, which instantly loses out on a lot of the available marks, both technical and professional. With the calculation element, the key piece of advice from a technique perspective is to include workings and words within your calculations to show what you're doing. This means if you make a mistake, but you do almost the right thing, the marker is able to award you credit for the steps which you did correctly. If you just have the odd number in your answer with no explanation, you may be losing out on several marks. Have a look at the model answer here for the sort of workings that we'd ideally be looking to see. Let's move on now to looking at the second question from the December 2023 exam. This one focused on a company making components for combustion engines in cars. In this question, the role that candidates were taking was as a qualified accountant and external consultant who had been hired by the company's CEO to advise on a few matters such as a transition toward the electric vehicle market and some reporting and ethical issues. Again, I'd recommend you pause the session here, take your time to refresh your memory and read the question and solution, and then click to continue. The first part of requirement 2A asked candidates to advise on possible leadership styles that the company could consider when managing the changes involved in their transition plan. The syllabus and the learning materials do go into quite a lot of detail on leadership styles and the impact they have when managing strategic change. For example, using the Johnson, Scholes and Whittingham models 5 leadership styles. However, quite a few candidates appeared not to recognise different leadership styles or focused instead on leadership traits which are different. The examining team commented that questions on leadership styles are common and that there are lots of similar examples in the learning materials which would have helped candidates to prepare well for this requirement. After looking at leadership styles, the next part of question 2A asked candidates to evaluate the power and interest of 3 of the company's stakeholder groups in relation to the transition plan: the customers, raw material suppliers, and shareholders. Based on this evaluation, candidates needed to recommend how the company should engage with each of these stakeholder groups in relation to the transition plan in the scenario. The examining team commented for this requirement that there was a clear structure which should have been used within candidates' answers, considering the power for each stakeholder, the interest of that stakeholder, and then a recommendation on how the company should engage with them. Although candidates generally appeared to be familiar with the matrix you'll see in the solution, which was the right way to look at the power and influence of stakeholders, very few candidates actually used this clear structure in answering the question, and instead just provided a more vague and jumbled discussion on stakeholders generally. Where there is a clear structure like this, using it will ensure that candidates touch on all aspects of the solution and are able to score more marks. The examining team also commented for this part of the question that many candidates' answers contained no or very limited application to the scenario. Here, knowing about the matrix and saying a stakeholder has high or low power or interest isn't enough. What the marker is looking for are specific comments about the stakeholders in this scenario, picking up on facts from the case study to apply these to the matrix. Moving on now to requirement 2B, which asked candidates to advise on integrated reporting. In the scenario, the company TA has been asked by its largest customer to provide an integrated report in line with their other suppliers. This customer has provided a framework for this integrated report, which is included as an exhibit to the question, and candidates need to advise on the content which the company could include under this framework. Again, here there is a natural structure for candidates to use in their answer, being the 4 headings within the framework in the exhibit. However, many candidates didn't do this, but instead provided a very generic answer on integrated reporting in general, with possible subject areas for any integrated report. The examiner wanted candidates to use the framework that had been given in the question and apply it to TA and the facts of the scenario. The final requirement of the exam paper was on some financial reporting aspects, namely how the company should or shouldn't be accounting for the new factory building. There are questions over the depreciation of the factory and its roof, with Carmen, the financial director, proposing a course of action which is questionable on both the reporting and ethical sides, and candidates were asked to advise from both these perspectives. Although most candidates generally recognised that there were issues with the proposed depreciation treatment, candidates scored poorly across the available marks. Surprisingly, many candidates included no numbers or no calculations within their answer. Figures had been included within the exam scenario to invite candidates to calculate the differences between the proposed and the correct approaches to the depreciation. Candidates' answers also stopped short on the ethical side of things. Although most candidates recognised that the proposed treatment wasn't great, very few explained why. The model answer here shows how the advice on the ethical angle can be expanded out. This is really worth looking at, as there's quite often a requirement in the exam which deals with an ethical dilemma. That brings us to the end of the paper. We'll just quickly recap on the key points and recommendations from the examining team before we bring this session to a close. In terms of key recommendations for those of you preparing to sit future diets of the ICMAP pathway exam, there are 4 I'd like to make, 3 of which are actually the same as we've included in previous exam debrief sessions. This time we saw more candidates than usual struggling with their technical knowledge. Make sure you dedicate enough time to your preparation across the full syllabus, as any area can be tested within the exam. Next, make sure you're thinking about your exam technique just as much as you're thinking about your technical revision and preparation. We've seen in this debrief session how the way you answer the question and specific tasks can have a massive impact on both the technical and professional skills marks that you're able to score. I'd actually recommend having another look at this December paper and model answers, and listening back to any sections of this debrief session which you feel are particularly relevant to you and your technique. You might even want to attempt parts of this paper under timed exam conditions, and then compare your answer to the model answer to help refine your exam technique. We'd also recommend that you do this sort of approach with some of the other available questions, either ones from previous exam sittings or questions available on the Study Hub platform. It's this really close comparison of your answer to the model answer which really refines and improves your technique, yet it's something that lots of candidates just don't do. And finally, we always recommend to take advantage of the available tuition if you're able to do so. That brings us to the end of today's session debriefing the December 2023 ICMAP Pathway exam, and I hope you found it useful. Thanks for listening, and we wish you the best of success in this exam when you come to sit.